The book has been in publication for a few months now. It's been about 6 or 7 months.
Well, it actually came out in January, so the better part of a year.
Sorry. I stand corrected. Okay, so 11 months and counting. And in this period, there must be hundreds and thousands of people who have already bought the book, read it, analyzed it, reviewed it, critiqued it, etc., 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 and they will continue to do so. And those of you who haven't yet managed to get hold of a copy of this book, please do so, and please read it ASAP. I say this for a reason. Particularly for those of us who live in this part of the subcontinent, Bangalore, the Deccan, people who've been here for a very long time, for generations, probably going back centuries, and other people who have become residents of this part of the country in more recent times. This is crucial reading. I'll tell you why, because a lot of us tend to go off to places like Hampi, Aihole, Badami, Patatkal, what have you, and also to places like Mahabalipuram. But what we do actually get out of these places are all the architectural marvels. We get to see how things were made, and we come away with a lot of received wisdom which has been handed down for decades or for a very long time. The difference with this book is that although it visits some of the sites which I've just mentioned, as well as a whole lot of others, it revisits the sites and the histories behind them far more in greater detail, with a lot more sensitivity, and with absolute meticulous, almost obsessive research and attention to historicity. A lot of talk has already gone around about the lords of the Deccan, but I thought we'd do something slightly different today, if you don't mind. The lords of the Deccan actually are a series of almost concurrent ruling dynasties: the Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, the Pallavas, and the Cholas. They span a period of roughly 5 centuries, from the 6th century current era to approximately the 12th and a half. But behind the lords of the title, or surrounding the lords of the title, are also these other people who aren't part of the ruling elite. Some of them are indeed part of the ruling elite. And these people I'm referring to are the ladies of the Deccan. And while this has been touched upon in great detail, I personally believe it hasn't been discussed enough, with reference to your work, your writing, and Lords of the Deccan. So could we take this conversation forward from there?
Of course, of course. So let me begin by thanking all of you for being here. It's just so exciting to have started on this passion project about 5 years ago now. Just sitting in my little room in Alsur and hammering away at my keyboard day and night. And frankly, writing a history that I wasn't sure anyone would really read. And to have it be launched by a major publisher, and to actually see people buying it, coming to events, asking me questions about it, getting me to sign copies of my book is actually, it's profoundly moving. So thank you all for being here this year. Thank you. And thank you also, Vikram. The mic, this good? You guys can hear me? Okay. And thank you also, Vikram, for not only for your magnificent review in Biblio, but also for asking this profoundly thoughtful question, because one thing that really struck me as I was writing and researching the history of this period, to explain that, you'll have to talk about a historian with whom I have a bit of a complex relationship by the name of Nilakanta Shastri. Now, I said something controversial about Professor Shastri yesterday on the poolside stage, which I'm not going to repeat today, unfortunately. But one thing that's quite interesting about the way that he writes his books is that there's a very clear divide between what he calls political history and what he calls, history, the society, culture, and within his society chapter, there's usually 1 or 2 pages dedicated to women. And by and large, this is a template that Indian historians have followed, especially historians of medieval South India have followed, saying that, so here's this particular queen who made this grant to a temple, and this is pretty much proof that this was an egalitarian society. And when I go back and I was actually looking at the inscriptions of these kings, I'm seeing things like, I captured the city of Kanchi, who was like the lady of the southern quarter, and I grabbed her by the girdle, and I was like, okay, that doesn't that doesn't really exactly sound like an egalitarian society. And these there's all these inscriptions again and again where kings talk about their military successes and how they defeat their enemy and they capture all their treasures, which includes elephants and horses and gold and jewelry and women. And that really got me thinking, because I think that a lot of the attitudes that we have in India today about women are actually rooted in the deep past and come from particular ways in which society was organized. And I find medieval South India so fascinating because while you certainly do have remarkable and powerful women who I talk about in my book, there's also all these other women who are hinted at but rarely ever named. I came across a mention of a woman who was assigned to work in a monastery in the Kaveri River Valley. And I say assigned to work, suggesting that she had a choice in the matter, which she did not. And it mentions that she actually tried to run away at some point, and then she was captured and brought back and then branded with a trident, so that if she were to run away again, she would be brought back. And I really began to think about the sheer amount of labor that is actually involved in running any society. Whether you look at our society, where women play such an enormous role in just running the household, very often barely acknowledged, let alone remunerated, and think about how our, thank you, think about how our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, the endless chain of our ancestors going back for 1,000 years have basically been doing that. They have been the ones tilling the fields, washing the dishes. They were the ones attending on the kings. They were the ones whose bodies were really on the line, as well as the men. They're not perhaps fighting the battles, but they are the quote-unquote treasures to be won. I realized that as I was writing this book, I could not simply blithely dismiss all of these stories in a couple of chapters, saying that this and that queen was doing okay and therefore all women are doing okay. I come from a farming family. My great-grandfather literally tilled other people's land, and so have my foremothers for generations before him. And when armies invaded our farms, they would have been carried away. And the only way I could do justice to those ancestors of mine, not just the nationally appointed cultural ancestors that these kings have become, the only way I can do justice to my actual ancestors and the blood and sweat and toil they put into making this world that we live in, was to really acknowledge at every point that I could in the book violence in all forms, not just military but also structural. Yeah, that's a beginning of an answer, I hope.
That's the beginning of an answer. While I was listening to you, I was reminded of something that the lovely and late Hilary Mantel says in Wolf Hall. Beneath every history, another history. It's remarkable that you actually present so much of this underlying history beneath, lying layers and layers going down. It would be interesting for us to know your research methodology, particularly with reference. Let's only stick to the women now. Is it epigraphic evidence? If so, where is it found? How reliable are those sources? Because there's very little in terms of oral history. But the curious thing is that, again, another cliche, history is really a mirror to the present. Yeah? Look at the state of affairs in the country today, in present times. Not only in the country, but globally. Purely in terms of the status or the absence thereof, or the agency or the absence of agency of women. So there are two questions, really. Your research methodology, particularly in this region, area of study, and your thoughts about the past continuing into the present.
Okay, so in terms of how research is conducted, so I would highly recommend to anybody who's really interested in understanding this period, go and read the primary sources for yourself. I think touching upon your second question, Vikram, I think half the reason why we are in the particular political situation where we find ourselves is because of what I would call a lack of historical literacy, in the sense that very few of us know how histories are told. To us, history is very often something that somebody is going to write in some book and that you're going to imbibe as received wisdom. But the way that I see history is that history is something that we are always constantly telling and retelling. Every story that we tell our children at night is once upon a time. Um, every story is, in a way, a history. Histories always reflect who we are and how we see the world. And so when I'm writing a history, I want to tell a story that's about people who are like you and me, that have the same kind of complex emotional worlds, and who also live in a world that, like ours, is not a utopia. It's one that is messed up. There are structural inequalities and structural violence. And so when I'm looking at inscriptions from this period, and one thing I consistently do through Lords of the Deccan is say, okay, so here's what the primary source, here's this inscription that this king or queen has made, and here's how we can read it, and here's the kind of information we can get from it. So just as we would read a political ad today and say that, hey, you know what? So the politician is claiming that every single household has been electrified, every single household has running water, but here's a photograph that says, no, this household absolutely does not have running water or electricity. And then we'd say, okay, so maybe the politician is being creative with the truth, and maybe there's a reason why they're doing that. Apply the same logic to medieval kings, because when they're sitting and claiming that, oh, I was upholding the dharma, and there's a very interesting inscription I came across where there's this Chola king in Tamil Nadu who says that, oh, the king was I was so handsome that the women on the shores of Persia are swooning and waiting for me to conquer it. Exactly. And this gentleman sitting in Tamil Nadu, and he's saying that. And it's interesting because, of course, he really can't conquer Persia, and if he wanted to, but why does he want to say that? And it comes from a particular cultural frame of mind that's very different from the world that we inhabit. So once you start seeing the past from that lens, you begin to see layers within these inscriptions. So when, for example, a queen is saying that, oh, I was so amazing and I have upheld the dharma and built this magnificent temple, what you're not seeing is this fact that the queen was probably married to the ruling prince when she was a teenager. She would have had to leave her motherland and come to a court where she probably didn't even speak the language. She would have been surrounded by all these other wives, the local aristocrats, who would have had better local connections and who would have been able to lobby for better positions for themselves and relatives. And still somehow she has fought her way up to the top. And she's making this inscription. But that does not mean necessarily that she is a feminist in the way that we would understand it. There's a good friend of mine who's an art historian called Vineet Vyas, who does a lot of work on gender and sexuality in the Mughal period, so much after the period that I write about. And he talks about this painter whose name has escaped me, so he was active in, I think, Kota in the 18th century, 17th, 18th centuries. And he's made this remarkable painting of a couple of palace women, so, serving women, servants, being beaten in the zenana. So they are tied up, they're cowering away from somebody who's whipping them with a stick. And behind them are two princesses who are giggling and watching this sight. And that really struck me because when we think about medieval courts, we think about, the glamorous kings, the glamorous queens, but I mean, all of us have we've read the page 3 stories, we know what celebrities can be like. And surely these medieval celebrities were also equally, let's say, finicky in their personal lives. They can't have been easy to get along with. And so what would they have been like to the people who are under them? Why do we assume that all of them would have been like, characters in a recent historical film, which I will not name because it'll get me into trouble. But why do you assume that they would all have been so nice and everybody would have been overjoyed to have worked for them and, and do unpaid labor for them? The reality of it is that just as we don't like our managers, there must have been a lot of medieval people who didn't like that as well. And we have to be open to that. So I'm not sure if that answers your questions directly, but I think it gives you a sense of how I think and approach these sources to look for these kinds of stories. And when I can't find the stories, still at least point out their absence. Because history is not just about the stories that survive, but also the stories that haven't survived. And it's important for us to be aware of those, even if we can't tell them.
And aside from stories which haven't survived, which actually haven't been told, for whatever reason, they've either been forgotten, obliterated, or actually buried. And when you see a book like Lords of the Deccan, people who approach this book expecting a sort of hagiography of all the greats of the Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, and the Cholas, and the Pallavas, are going to be mildly disappointed because there are lots of very uncomfortable findings in this which actually make you sit up and say, oh really, did that happen? Are we sure it happened? And then you flip to the back of the book and there's this solid bibliography and solid academic citations and references which cannot be faulted. At the same time, what the Lords of the Deccan does is that it's so eminently readable. And for me, that was what was most compelling, aside from the historical material and the level and depth of your research, is the way you convey this material almost effortlessly, and that's purely, I think, because these aren't just names, these aren't just dates, these are people, yeah? Flesh and blood human beings, just like you and me and all of us, warts and all. And then you can actually connect, you can relate, and that is actually one of the most winning features of this book. Which brings me to the next question. Where do you see writing history and the conveyance of historical writing? This is history. It's not like historical fiction like what I do. I can actually get away with blue murder in my kind of writing, but you can't. Yeah? Where do you see, what direction do you see the writing of historical history onwards from now?
Well, I mean, that's difficult to answer.
Yeah.
But
Which is why I asked you, you handle difficulties well.
well, I really hope that Lords of the Deccan is going to inspire people to write more histories. I feel like, unlike many other countries, in India, the writing of history has become something that's very separate from the public. It's seen as something that happens primarily in universities, partially because of the structure of the publishing industry, and I recognize the irony of saying this at a book fest. Partly because the structure of the publishing industry is very Delhi-centric, the histories that we have read are also very Delhi-centric. And I suppose that's just human nature. You know, you're going to get your friends to write books that you relate to. But I'm hoping that Lords of the Deccan proves that there are not just people in South India who can write books like this, but also there's a market and there's an enormous appetite and a hunger for stories that people can relate to. What I have really enjoyed about being in Bangalore again after all these years is people have been coming out to me and telling me, in fact, one of my dear friends was telling me earlier that they now see the history of Karnataka with completely new eyes, and they have a respect for it that they did not before. And I want more young historians in Odisha, in Assam, in Manipur, especially Manipur, one of the great crossroads of Indian history that nobody talks about. I want them to be getting their book deals. I want them to be sitting and writing and telling their stories to all of us. Because I think we've gone for 75 years after independence with only a single story being told to us about what India is. And keep in mind, it's a very elite story. It seems like every other year, and I see this with all due respect to the historians who are writing on Mughal India, I don't think we need a history of Akbar every single year. We all know Akbar's life, you know? And these are magnificent books. These are great to read. And I'll be honest, I'll be a lot more worried when we don't have histories of Akbar anymore. But I hope that also proves, that Lords of the Deccan also proves that we need more histories. And selling only a single narrative, whether it's driven only by a particular religio-political agenda or a particular idea of what constitutes royal grandeur, beggars us all. And in a country with such a richness and wealth of histories, let's bring it back to life and let's all enjoy and revel in these stories in all of their dark splendor.